morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the next webinar in our series, our SoCI webinar series, SoCI 2024, Where to From Here. Before we get going, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am joining you from today, that of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us today, and also mindful of where you might be joining us from today as well. The aim for today's webinar is not only to assist you in ticking a box and getting yourself organized for your critical infrastructure risk management program submission, but really to leave you with some thought-provoking ideas and pragmatic takeaways that you can implement in your organization to achieve what good might look like for you. So please remember, as usual, the Q&A box is open. Please feel free to send questions throughout the session, and our subject matter experts and panel will be glad to answer them as we go through. But before I introduce our panel to you and delve into why we're actually here, I'd like to share a little anecdote with you, which there is a little bit of method to my madness, so if you'd indulge me for just a moment. I have a friend in South Africa who is a very accomplished dentist and a very accomplished athlete as well. She was riding her bicycle and she noticed that the setup on her bicycle wasn't quite right. So she took a video of her setup and she sent it through to her physiotherapist to ask for advice. I asked her why the physiotherapist. Now, the physiotherapist that she sent the video to has been a long serving physiotherapist of hers, a relationship for many, many years. To which she answered, my physiotherapist did her thesis in bike setups, and the person that I used to get my bike set up from is no longer available. So I said, you as an accomplished dentist, would you go to someone to perform root canal on you, for example, who had a wealth of knowledge and had written the book on root canal, but performed his or her last root canal 20 or 30 years before that? To which she replied, absolutely not. Now, the reason that I'm sharing this story with you is because all of our subject matter experts in our panel today don't only have a wealth of knowledge and experience in operating in the fields in which we're going to be chatting about today, but they've actually been on the tools and they actually operate on the tools and understand how to practically apply the knowledge that they're going to be sharing with you in your organizations. So without any further ado, I would like to please introduce our panel to you, starting off with Joe Saunders, who's our head of training and education of the Risk to Solution group, who is also, I'll let Joe do intro himself, who is our human-centric people security specialist, personnel security specialist. Next, we have Dr. Paul Johnston, who's our behavioral scientist, lead risk consultant, and self-professed risk nerd. Paul, funnily enough, is actually the person that created Australia's first integrated security of critical infrastructure gap analysis tool, aligned to ISO 31000. So in Paul's language, that's kind of cool. Next, we have Dan du Plessis, who's a newcomer to the screens of our Risk to Solution webinars, but certainly not a newcomer to the Risk to Solution family, and certainly not a newcomer to the security, the physical security space. And finally, Sean Finn, who is our head of cybersecurity at Risk to Solution, and Sean will tell you himself that he's lost many a Christmas holiday due to cyber breaches. So without any further ado, let's kick the ball into play. And Joe, if I could start with you, share a little bit about yourself with us.
Sure, thanks, Dave. Look, I guess my background is easily summarized in that it's a weird combination of psychology and security. I started off studying psychology, wanting to be a psychologist, and ended up being diverted into the world of security and got really fascinated by the human behavior aspect of security risk management. And over the years, that has taken me in many different directions, whether that's violence prevention, whether it's family domestic violence, countering violent extremism, but also looking at proactive controls to look for insider threats, for personnel vetting, for maintaining psychosocial health in the workplace, to eliminate vulnerabilities from an insider threat point of view, and a variety of other spaces as well. So my real passion in the security sector is the humans. What do humans do? How do we get humans to play their part and to do what we want them to do to make sure that the rest of our security systems and infrastructure is working as well as it possibly can be? So very happy to be taking the lead on the PERSEC material on this webinar.
And no better person to do that for us. Thanks, Joe. Paul?
Thank you, David. As David actually said before, I'm the in-house behavioural scientist. Probably the best description of my role is a protective services behavioural scientist. So my role is to help individuals and organisations make better decisions, particularly under stress. My background, it's sad when you say it out loud, I realised the other day it's 33 years experience in safety and security risk management, starting off in the military before I went into corrective services and law enforcement, before I went to the dark side of corporate consulting in the same fields. Now, although I am a behavioural scientist, I love myself a good management system. And what I find actually frustrates me to a degree is that we actually separate the two, we silo them. But if we have a look at a lot of the management systems that we can put in place and should put in place, should actually be culture change tools to actually achieve that. So that's I suppose the focus that I actually adopt when I am consulting. And I did my PhD and have operational experience in bushfire risk management. So fascinated with that human interface in terms of natural disasters as well. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Doc. Dan, over to you.
Morning, Dave. Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Great being here and forming part of this this team that we have. Nesting in slightly on the protective side, on the security side. On my side, I started my career in the police force in South Africa, so very protective, enforced and high-risk law enforcement environment. Spent an extensive time of probably about 7 years within law enforcement background, specifically targeting tactical operations, high-risk operations, where we focused on tactical intervention, anti-terrorism, and high response and crime. When I left, I further developed my core skill, deviated into close protection, personnel protection mostly, asset protection. Looking after people was a core business, where obviously fundamentally we learned how to make sure that everyone is protected according to their individual requirements and making sure everybody's safe. My career delved me through overseas. I spent approximately 8 years on the shores of Australia, working for one of the passenger cruise line companies within maritime security infrastructure management. So complete deviation from where I was before, driving me to obviously fall in the safe, capable hands of the Risk 2 Solution family that snapped me up to complement their team of experts to assist them further with the global approach, and obviously bringing me together to assist and drive the actual protective security side of the SoCI alignment.
Thanks, Dan. And last but certainly not least, Sean.
Thanks, Dave. Look, I love listening to the last three presenters. I feel very safe and supported when I'm in the workplace around this team. So it's a great place to work. My history goes back, well, look, about 30 years. I'm scaring myself now in starting with online bulletin board systems through to the early days of the internet, creating websites, hosting websites, ultimately creating data centers and owning data centers. I did that for about 15 years and had literally thousands of servers that were being hacked all day, every day. So I learned my trade the hard way through just watching stuff be attacked, be hacked, go offline, and just having to fix it up for business survival. I moved into enterprise, working for a few different enterprise groups, but most notably Caterpillar for a couple of years, working with autonomy and mining equipment and mining trucks in incident response and forensic analysis of software incidents globally. So that was pretty cool. And I've just come off the back of spending about 8 years at Boeing working in cybersecurity in that area in a defence and aviation context. So there's an absolute huge array of different industries there and different perspectives on cyber. And I'm loving my journey so far.
Thanks, Sean. I have to say that I've been on many appointment client engagements with various members of the panel at different times, and I've listened to their intros countless times, and I never actually get sick of them. They are really quite remarkable, and it's really humbling for me to be in the presence of each one of them. So, right, let's get some information going and let's get some pragmatic discussion going. As I mentioned, please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A. We'd love to get to them. A reminder: this is a webinar for you. It's not about what we want to tell you, but it's about what you want to know. So please let us know what you want to know, and we will do our very best to let you know. Right, Joe, if I could start off with you with our first discussion point. Now, in an era where insider threats are a growing concern, now insider threats have really now split into two domains, if we want to call it that. An insider threat which has got malicious intention, or a trusted insider which has no malicious intention. So it's really that personnel aspect of the organization. Now, where these insider threats are growing concern, what are some of the effective strategies for personnel security and critical infrastructure, particularly in sectors like energy and transport? We do a lot of work in the transport industry. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question, Dave. And honestly, this could be the next 45 minutes. So I'll try to keep my answers brief so that everyone else has a chance to answer questions directed at them also. Look, I think it's a massive topic. Insider threat is a massive topic. Information security, information sharing, whether information can be compromised or sent elsewhere. And then there's just straight up sabotage as well, not even theft of information from an insider threat point of view. Look, I think we tend to lean very heavily on vetting for obvious reasons. If we can stop potentially problematic individuals getting into the workplace, getting into a trusted environment before, then great, we should do that. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that I see is an over-reliance on vetting or an overconfidence that the vetting has been done and therefore we're safe and we don't have to do anything else. We've seen gaps with not just with our clients, but with broader industry as well, where perhaps their internal employees have been vetted, but their contractors haven't, and the contractors might make up 2/3 of their workforce. So, well, how good is your vetting if 2/3 of the workforce are just on a handshake? They said they're okay. They said they checked them, but we don't really know. That's not great. Also, vetting is only a point in time. If someone's been with the organisation for 20 years, who they are now may be very different to who they were in 1994 or in 2004 or whenever. So I think it's really important for us to have an ongoing system. But I think there's also a framework that we need to be looking at too, in terms of how we classifying information. If I'm just talking about the information side for now, how we classifying information, how we classifying roles. If we don't have those frameworks in place, everything becomes a case-by-case basis, and we open up the floodgates for mistakes to be made in terms of people having too much access, people being able to get into places or into information they really don't have a need for, and therefore we create a vulnerability unnecessarily. I know Sean will talk about that from a cyber lens, definitely, but even just in terms about like access control into a facility. Is there a reason why your CFO needs to have a swipe card that gets them into manufacturing? I don't know. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but these are questions that you should be looking at across the whole domain of security, not just in terms of cyber and documents and so on. So I could go on a lot. I think, honestly, having a framework in place that allows you to make good decisions automatically, as opposed to a case-by-case personal human error laden environment is fundamental. And then from there, we need to have good vetting, and vetting that is risk-based. We shouldn't be intrusive and stomping all over someone's personal life if it doesn't matter, or if it really, they're not in a position where that could be problematic for us. So we need to be risk-based in terms of how we're actually doing that vetting, and then making sure that we're continually checking that vetting. How are we monitoring someone's psychosocial well-being moving forward? how are we checking, identifying different changes in patterns of behavior, patterns of work productivity, their lateness, whether they're downloading documents, whether they seem to be transferring files, whether there's any sort of unusual system behavior. All those kinds of things need to be built in as an ongoing process. And then probably the last thing I'd throw in there, there's a lot we could talk about, but the last thing I'd throw in is overall, what is our security culture? Is everybody else in the organization empowered to recognize insider threat behaviors and call them out, or have a safe way of saying, I saw this, it's probably nothing, but it was a little bit odd. How do I then voice that and have that treated in a way that isn't, they're not worried about their best mate getting raided by counterterrorism police the next day if it really wasn't anything. So how do we go about doing all of those things? So I think systems, good vetting that is risk-based, and then ongoing management beyond that would be my summary if I've done that in a couple of minutes.
Joe, that's awesome. And I'm going to ask you to hold the mic there for a second, because I'm going to throw back to you. And I really want to get the rest of the panel's perspective on this, particularly through the lenses of which they work through every day. You mentioned vetting. Now, vetting is, how long is a piece of string? So we've got people on the call, organizations, entities on the call, small to medium-sized enterprises, large enterprises, federal government, state government, local government. Just obviously there's no one size fits all to vetting. And I'm going to ask the rest of the panel to weigh in on this discussion as well. But through your lens, Joe, if I could start with you, what are the critical points that organizations and entities could look at that determine how much vetting is required pragmatically for my organization? To your point, we don't need to go into the last 55 years of people's history and understand what they had for breakfast, but sort of what are those? It's a big question. I'm aware that it's a big question, but if we could provide just a few dot points for our audience on what does good vetting look like?
Yeah, so I guess the 3 dot points that come immediately to mind would be a risk assessment. We need to be risk assessing and classifying. Again, that coming back to what you just said about role classification, is with that particular role, how much of a risk do they possibly present to the organization? What do they have access to? How much damage could they cause? How much autonomy do they have? All those kinds of things, I think, would be part of our risk assessment, and that will have to feed into, well, any risk assessment needs to feed into risk control. So the control would be the vetting. So how much vetting do we need to apply to that particular individual in that particular role to be confident that we've got everything right? Which leads probably into the next point I'd make, which is about proportionality and necessity. So the vetting shouldn't be, we shouldn't be going nuclear on everybody. It's a waste of resources. It's invasive. It may even be a legal issue. So apologies if anyone just heard dogs barking. I swear it's not a raid. It's just dogs. But I would just say that I think proportionality is really important to the risk, and also just resourcing and budgets and allocations and so on to make sure we're using that appropriately. And the last point is making sure we're respecting legal and ethical guidelines and getting permission and consent, and everything that people will be subjected to, they're consenting to, and we make sure, and not just from it should be okay because it sounds right, but rather actual legal advice about what we're allowed to check for and where our boundaries need to be, and communicating that very clearly and transparently with everybody.
Awesome. Sean, could I throw to you next from a cyber perspective? What does vetting look like?
Oh, look, I can speak about vetting in a broader defence I guess concept. When you're working on Australian government systems, there's various different levels of vetting, depending on the classification of the system that you're working on. So we've got a framework called the ISM, the Information Security Manual, and there's a bunch of different levels in there. So you've got official sensitive systems, secret system, top secret systems. And from a cyber context, working on those different systems, or just working on those systems in general, it depends on the information that you're exposed to as to what level of vetting you need in a government context. So in order to work on official sensitive systems, you might need a baseline security clearance, and that's handled by the AGSFA, the Australian Government Security Vetting Organisation. There's levels above that. For secret systems, you need NV1, negative vetting level 1, where they look into your background. negative vetting level 2s for top secret systems. And then there's levels beyond that called positive vetting, where they probe much more deeply into your life. So from a cyber defense kind of viewpoint, those things are already in place to a really hardcore degree.
Doc, from a behavioral science perspective, and a human-centric element, a human-centric perspective. So vetting, to Joe's point, needs to be role-based, needs to be organizational-based, but it also needs to link very closely to the culture of the organization. What are your key takeaways through your lens regarding vetting?
Thank you, David. That's actually a pretty complex question. I'm sure you'll be sick of me saying that towards the end of the day. But I love the example that Joe actually gave before, that simple example of the swipe card to a certain area. What I actually find is it's not just the security culture of the organisation in terms of their whole awareness, and it's not just awareness, but their active application of security principles, but it's the recognition that security clearance isn't a personality trait. It's not an asset. It is essentially a set of keys. So if you don't need access to a certain area, it's not a slight on your personality or the fact that you're not important enough. It's task related. And I think that is really, it's probably the biggest impact that I've seen from a behavioural perspective, is that people have to understand what they're talking about. It's not like a frame to put on the wall. In fact, security clearances should be dealt with rather discreetly, which is another issue which we're not seeing on social media at the moment. So it should be more a cultural aspect and an understanding of those implications.
Thanks, Doc. And finally, just Dan, from a physical security perspective, and I'm going to ask you to tie in your answer with a question that Paulina's just raised. In terms of physical security, what are some of the underutilized tactics or technologies that could significantly improve the security posture of critical infrastructure facilities? So if you were able to tie in those technologies and tactics with vetting, how would you see that coming together?
Thanks, Dave. So to answer your first question, Dave, on vetting specifically, obviously there's a very direct and sort of alignment on getting the correct vetting done for people based on the risk, obviously, and the actual information that they access. It is important to remember that having that tick box vetting exercise does not always make sure or ensure that that person that is vetted to level 1, 2, or 3 is not able to compromise your solution, your company, or the infrastructure they're at. So it is important to maintain that people component. And what I've experienced through my career is that it's important to always know your team, know your company, know the people that you work with, to maintain and facilitate and piggyback off the actual infrastructure that has been set up, the systems, the policy, to vet people to a certain level, because personal circumstances can change people's position, even though they're vetted and accredited to a certain level. When that integrates to the actual tactics and technology that is able to be implemented, it is important to understand that obviously there are various technologies around that can be implemented to augment infrastructure and support it. Huge drives that work into the data technologies, digitization of systems, analytics. That is a big component of technology that come into security infrastructure, and they all align into physical security components like access control, surveillance systems. I believe the big component here is for businesses, for management of companies to be able to align the systems with technologies and implement them together to have a global aggregated based approach where they integrate together and work together. For example, if you are working with manpower alone, there are definite benefits where by bringing in surveillance systems, by bringing technology, you can actually make that a force multiplier, bringing analytics to actually make your solution more effective. So for me, to answer that question in a nutshell, an answer is to be able to, most important part here is being able to integrate technology with existing systems and manpower systems that you have on the ground.
Thanks, Dan. Great answer. And that really gives me a good segue. And Sean, I'm going to throw to you next. To start off this discussion, Dan left off there with integration. Pauline asked a great question there about, underutilized tactics. Dan, with that process of integration, Sean, how we've seen how all of these domains operate independently of one another, but now we've seen, particularly with physical security and cybersecurity, there is that convergence that's starting to happen, thankfully, right? Through your lens and your area of expertise, how do you see all four of these domains integrating with one another to improve efficiencies and outputs? Or do you even believe that they should be integrated? Should they be operating independently?
Hey, Dave, that's an absolutely cracking question. Dan touched on three different things, and I'll paraphrase Dan. He said, we've got to integrate technology with existing systems and people. So this is going back to people, process, tools. It all comes back to people, process, and tools. These are the three key areas. Dan touched on physical access control, physical surveillance systems, and analytics to be more effective. Definitely in the cyber realm, we talk about the same thing. We've got identity and access management. We've got access control. We've got security event monitoring. So that's our surveillance systems and analytics, automated response tools or AI or all this cool stuff to tell us how to respond in an event. So there's absolutely convergence in these different areas.
Thanks, Sean. Doc, if I could throw to you next, what does integration essentially look like to you or not?
Well, you throw me the easy questions. Integration is a buzz phrase, but actually is being used a lot nowadays. But I think we have to realise that when we're talking about all these issues at hand, all these SoCI-related issues, we're talking about what we actually call wicked problems. Is that, when we fix one issue, other things seem to pop up all the time. So to me, in terms of what integration means and how we can achieve that to a degree, is to understand the nature of the issues at hand and how they interrelate. So integration doesn't just happen. And I often use a tool which is some would actually think was a strange tool to use, but it's actually a behavioural modification tool developed by Albert Ellis many years ago, the ABC model, which is essentially antecedents, behaviours and consequences. And the behaviour, for instance, would be the issue at hand, where there may be a natural disaster, may be security vetting, it may be security access. And then we actually consider both sides of the equation. What is actually the activator or the antecedent that makes that an issue? So what are the lead up or the background factors that creates that? And then we have consequences at the output in terms of what would the impact be? Or in fact, are we almost inadvertently encouraging certain behaviours? And I know that seems like a roundabout way, but if we actually understand how all these factors interact, I think the integration piece can be far better mapped. It's still not going to be an easy task, but I think we'll have a better understanding of the issue at hand.
Great point there. And I think, preparation's key. Joe, if I could throw to you next on that point, you've, sort of been around in a lot of places and done a lot of very interesting things in isolation. Now, putting that all together and integrating it into one meaningful, pragmatic solution for organizations, from your chair, what does that look like?
Wow, that's depends very much on the organisation. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but integration is about it's about integrating as many possible treatments or solutions or opportunities as possible into one cohesive system to make things more efficient, or to make things more easily understood or less complicated if we can. But ultimately, it depends on the organisation. Integration for the sake of laziness sometimes brings things undone. So sometimes things need to be siloed to a degree, or they need to be separated, or we need to have firewalls. We need to have things in place so that the whole system can't fall apart in one fell swoop. But without looking at the context of the organization, it is quite difficult to be able to say, this is good, this is bad. What I will say, though, about integration at a bare minimum is that there should be free sharing of information amongst properly vetted and properly senior people so that everyone has an understanding of what each other is dealing with, and we can identify areas where there might already be institutional knowledge or additional resources or dormant capabilities within teams that might be able to solve a problem for someone else. When we have those silos so firmly entrenched, sometimes we lose the ability to be able to help each other out, even though there might have been capacity and knowledge to do so. So I think that basic level of integration is pretty much universal. Beyond that, it really depends on what we're dealing with, what the problems are, what the solutions are, what the budget is, what the organizational structure allows for. There's a lot of different what ifs involved there to be able to give you a clear answer on that.
So the message that I'm getting, and I'm loving the different perspectives from the different angles. Dan, I'm going to come to you next. Security is predominantly an area where, we're the protectors, and the tech guys don't really understand our domain. But now we're increasingly, to the point that we raised earlier, we're increasingly starting to see the need for that convergence to bring people across, and security needs to be adopted as a culture in the organization, both from a technical security aspect and a physical security aspect. Security is no longer about guards, guns, and gates. Security needs to be around the table, from my perspective. Agree or disagree, and what does that look like in an organization?
Dave, I fully agree with you there. So it's not a one stance, one shoe, one size fits all solution anymore. Especially if you look at the 4 pillars that SoCI represents, there's a definitive integration between all of them. If you look at security in general, has always been seen as the necessary evil, and just being there to tick a box in a way. It comes down to the organization as a whole. It is a culture change where there needs to bring an involvement for everyone, an understanding and appreciation of what they view security as. There needs to be a view of a return on investment of security. So if you're looking at security purely as somebody just closing the gate so I can feel safer, it is not potentially the correct approach. You need to look at what can we do, or what is the solution that we implement better to give us a return on investment long-term down the line to prevent a long-term loss. It's not always the immediate loss that we look at for a phone going missing or a gate being broken or a car being stolen, or hopefully not more, but sometimes that does happen. Integrating solutions. If you're looking at the 4 pillars now where we're standing with SoCI, there is a critical integration with technology, how technology advances. And we spoke earlier about how technology is advancing. The questions were, how can we bring in strategies to implement better security, better technology, and to make security more efficient? The way technology is advancing now is everything's driving toward data, driving towards internet connectivity, and we all need to align with that. Everything is pretty much on the cloud-based. Physical security needs to integrate on that, and people need to move with that. The physical part, the people part will always be there. We cannot go away from that, and we form an integral part of that, because if we let the machines do all the working for us, we lose that integration and we lose a certain aspect of physical security that still needs to be implemented. So that component of integration between everyone is very important. It is a culture change, and it's definitely an absorption and an acknowledgement from everyone internally to drive that and make sure that awareness is pushed.
Thanks, Dan. And if I could just address 2 questions that have come in from the audience. The first question comes in from Chris. And Chris asks, the SoCI Act specifies that AUSCHECK as a required level of vetting, although the SoCI rule goes against this and lays the level of clearance on the organization. Is AUSCHECK enough, or should we be doing more? Joe, I'm going to ask you to comment on that, but just before I do, I know that Hamish has been on many of our webinars in the past. And Home Affairs have made it very clear, Chris, that AUSCHECK is not the must-have. It's not the have-to. It's a suggestion. It's a good suggestion, and it's one of many other solutions to clearances and vettings. It's not the must-have. Joe, if I could ask you just to elaborate on Chris's question there as well.
Yeah, sure, Dave. Look, all I'll just add to that, and you've kind of summarised what I was about to say anyway, just from a guidance point of view. But at a more broader level, to elevate this conversation, I think the onus should always be on the ownership. Oh, sorry, let me start that again. The onus should always be on the organisation to appropriately vet their personnel. Now, if you don't believe that any standard that is mandated as a compliance-based metric is sufficient, then you should be doing more. Because ultimately, compliance is the lowest level of control. We want to be compliant, but that shouldn't be a goal. It shouldn't be our goal to be compliant. It should be, that's our baseline. From there, our goal needs to be to develop resilience, and since we're here, presilience, and really striving to be ahead of the curve and to be building better systems than what the government tells us we need to have. And that should be the mindset all the time. That's not necessarily a comment on AusCheck and whether it's good enough or not good enough. Ultimately, everyone has to take ownership of how they're vetting their personnel, how they're protecting their organizations, not just looking at what is mandated in legislation. And that's just not just about vetting, but everything we do. Compliance, again, is not the standard. Compliance is the minimum requirement. So yeah, that's all I'd say about that one.
Joe, don't leave just yet. Kit has asked the question, when implementing Australian Standards 4811 for workforce screening, what are the key points you think organizations miss or misunderstand?
Yeah, sure. Look, again, it could be a really big topic, and we'll end up doing an entire webinar on insider threat if we're not careful. But I will just say that in addition to my previous points, or I guess re-emphasizing some of the previous points, understanding the scope and the depth of the screening that is required for different roles. Sometimes we go too hard and we make things inconvenient. We know that security and convenience usually sit on different ends of the seesaw, and we still need to be enable business to be done. And sometimes too much control can make things slower. So it's important that we get that balance right. I think consistency, so making sure that things are done the same way every time. And we're not just avoiding that. We're just ignoring the rules this time because we absolutely need a bum in a seat by Monday and we don't have time to do the proper background check. So let's just roll with it because he looks good on paper. And the first reference we called, which might have been his mum putting on a fake voice, was okay. We need to make sure that we are applying consistency across the line. And then verifying that information. The information we receive is not gospel just because it's on LinkedIn or just because it came from a company email address. We need to be verifying that information as well. And then probably just that ongoing piece, the ongoing scanning, screening, and continually looking at behavioral risk factors. I think those are probably the areas where I see people applying the standard, but maybe not going far enough, or maybe going too far and wasting time and resources as well. So that's a general commentary.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joe. And again, to your point, I think we probably do need a webinar on vetting and the insider threat. So maybe that's a topic for another day as well. Craig Brain and Sean, I'm going to throw this one to you because it's something that I grapple with regularly in talking to clients. Craig Brain has asked, I've seen a number of organizations adopt a NIMBY, not in my backyard, to even admitting there is an insider threat. Yes, organizations do have policies, and to Joe's point, compliance box ticked, but the appetite to really enforce that policy is lacking. Now, I can have a webinar just on discussing that point. But Sean, from your perspective, what can be done to overcome this?
Yeah. So look, you've got to, I guess, link the consequence of something occurring to an executive sponsor or owner. Anytime there's not an executive sponsor or owner to a particular problem set, there's not going to be any buy-in because there's no skin in the game. We're seeing with many of these different frameworks that are coming out, like different cybersecurity frameworks, but also through SoCI, that we have to implement these things to be compliant, to get the tick, to get signed off. Ultimately, that's done by yes, on the grassroots, we've got a bottom-up approach. We want to get this stuff done, but now we've got a top-down approach as well, where if we don't get it, there's a consequence. So I think. In order to drive that behavior, you've got to have a good balance of the two and a good linkage of the two. Someone's responsible, somebody owns a problem set, has the tools to be able to acknowledge what could possibly go wrong, as well as the authority to be able to fix it up. All those things have to be aligned to get it across the line. But the same thing holds true not just for background checks, but for a whole range of different controls, background checks and insider threats just being one of many. And cyber's huge in the amount of controls that it's got to have.
And a much bigger topic as well to unpack more there. Let's move on to natural hazards. Doc, I'm going to throw this one to you, having done your PhD in bushfires. Considering the increasing complexity of natural hazards and their potential impact on critical infrastructure, how can the human perspective inform risk management practices better to prepare and to respond to such events? So being a resilient organization, we like prevention, we like opportunity centricity, so we don't want to be focusing all our energy on response, but how do we proactively prepare?
Thanks, Dave. I think, in terms of that, it's a matter of mindset. I know that is easier said than done, but let's just start with two quick comments or observations that we seem to be obsessed with controlling all our risk exposures. Now, when it comes to natural disasters, that's actually quite a challenge. And the second statement is that insurance companies and insurance industry actually call natural disasters or natural exposures acts of God. So let's actually try and weigh those two elements up together while we're trying to actually control without getting too esoteric. So to me, what we have to understand is how we can be better prepared. And remember that natural hazards are actually wicked problems again, as I mentioned earlier. So we have to understand the interrelation between all these aspects. And I will actually go back to that same model I actually spoke about earlier, that ABC model, because I think this is actually key to organisations understanding the nature of what's actually at hand. Understand what the activators are, what the actual issue is, and what the potential outcomes are. And actually appreciating what we can control and what we can't control, we can manage and influence the other factors, as opposed to putting all our efforts into controlling things we can just not control. And just a very quick example of that, for instance, would be bushfire threat. Now, bushfires are only actually a threat when it interacts with infrastructure, people, investments, et cetera, But people don't understand, and organisations don't tend to understand the nature of bushfire risk management. Is that we don't have to have a mineral fire break around an area, so it's just dirt. We can do mosaic burns, so we actually maintain the biodiversity, we maintain the ecology, and that also allows us to have a more practical approach to mitigating the potential threat or the potential impacts from bushfires on a certain site. So to me, without sort of taking up 2 hours, is developing a mindset of control what we can, influence and manage that we can't, but understand the nature of those issues at hand.
Thanks, Doc. And again, so many big points there to unpack, but mindful that we're running out of time very, very quickly, and so much more that I really want to cover across the other domains. Dan, I'm going to bring you in on the conversation now as well. So we touched on it earlier with one of the questions that we've got in, but physical security is often seen as that first line of defense for critical infrastructure. If we can provide a few cost-effective, innovative approaches or technologies that we could use that can be implemented to enhance physical security measures without, throwing a spanner in the works and impeding operations or inconveniencing stakeholders. We always know the narrative of, in the battle of usability versus security, usability is always going to win. People are always going to find ways to circumvent security measures. But from your seat, what are those pragmatic, cost-effective solutions that organizations should be looking at?
Thanks, Dave. So interesting question here. You got to define, I think we need to step this back and define what cost-effective means. And I think from an enterprise and a consumer perspective, and then building it down to the user or company or entity, I believe cost effectiveness has got different definitions to each individual, and it's based on what you are trying to address. What might be cost effective to address in security, or might be a cost effective security solution for one entity, will definitely be different to someone else. And it comes down to what are you trying to protect and what value you are putting to the actual asset or the people or the information you are trying to protect. I think there's a fine balance, and there needs to be a understanding of what the return on investment is for upgrading your infrastructure. As I mentioned before, and we sort of deviated into this earlier, and that obviously there's a large amount of technologies available. Like I said, digitization is a big thing now. Building into surveillance infrastructure, analytics, access control with cars, biometrics, face identification, all that comes into play, but that still has an upfront cost. Some of these high level technologies does have a large or significant cost to an entity or enterprise to invest. That needs to be justified not only on an upfront return on investment, but a long-term return on investment. That is a cultural change. I think that is also a mindset change from where companies need to look at what am I protecting now? What am the money I'm investing now? What is it going to provide me now, or versus to later? And looking at SoCI specifically, if you're looking at networks, and I'm sure Sean can substantiate this and grow on this, even though you actually look at how our systems now integrate, it is going to, the whole way we spend money is long-term, and how we integrate the solutions together. And it shouldn't just be looking at access control or the gate in front of the actual gate at the front is protecting just the building. It is also protecting the networks. It's also protecting the systems and the people that integrate with it.
Can I jump in there just for a second? If you want cost effectiveness for your security spend, make sure you aren't allowing people to take company credit cards to trade shows. the number of times people come home with a robot or a fancy doohickey because it looked really cool and they gave me a free coaster. But yeah, no, just a little bit of lightheartedness there. But I think there's always an urge to spend money on tech because it looks cool and it's a good water cooler story when you get back with it or you implement it. But yeah, I think all Dan's points are very valid there. Get someone who's not excited about it to verify it first.
And I can honestly say that this wasn't scripted, but Joe, that is a fantastic segue to what I'd actually like to ask Sean on that very, very point. Now, Sean, cyber threats are evolving all the time. And we know, to Joe's point that he just made, is if we throw money at the problem, we have what we call risk theater, which is this illusion of comfort and this illusion of control and this illusion of being protected. But what are some of the challenges that we're facing, particularly in the Australian critical infrastructure sector? And what are the things that we should be looking at and the proactive measures that organizations should be looking at? Is throwing money at the problem going to fix it? Maybe yes, maybe no, depending on the type of the organization. But from your perspective, what are some of these key challenges, and what approach should we be looking at to improve our cyber posture?
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to entitle this section "Don't Buy Joe's Robot." So it's that was an absolutely fantastic example. So the key here, to pick out your key points, we've got a rapid evolution of cyber threats in relation to Australia's critical infrastructure sector, and your question is, what can we be doing to safeguard against this rapid emergence, or what can we prioritise to do it? Don't buy the robot. Number one. The key to this is rapid organisation. We need to rally around threats as they rapidly come out. So we need the ability to be nimble and quickly respond. So what we're seeing, though, is in reality, we're seeing a race to maturity, basic level maturity driven by legislations. It's a race to compliance, not to resilience, not to resilience or to a high level of maturity, but just to the basics. We are seeing a linkage of cybersecurity to an organisation's top-level risk management system. So this is the executive buy-in that I was talking about before. Absolutely critical. So I think that's already underway. We don't have to prioritise that. That's kind of being driven by legislation and getting cyber out of the realm of IT. So it's not just IT's problem. It's a business-level problem, and it's about protecting the business, what it delivers, and ultimately protecting the things we value in society itself, whether that's water, electricity, telecommunications, defence, all of that. It's really about protecting that. What sets cybersecurity apart from traditional risk and response are the cycle times and how quickly a threat can be identified and exploited. Insanely fast, absolutely ridiculously fast. Response times measured in years and quarters and executive plans and stuff, they just won't cut it anymore. In cyber, we talk about the zero-day threats and vulnerabilities, meaning today. It's been released today, being exploited today. That's the pace that these things are being discovered, and that's increasing. There's more of them being discovered per week, and being exploited rapidly, faster. In some instances in the case of ours, and it's only going to get worse. The storm's increasing. Thankfully, there's an opportunity here. We've got to look at what the US energy sector is doing, and they show us what good looks like. And so there's been a similar thing in the US, race towards critical infrastructure security through legislation reform, big beasts. So what do we do? What lessons can we take from them? There's a shift from compliance to continuous compliance. And in the defence realm, there's a thing called continuous authority to operate. It's not just building a system, getting it assessed, and then every year getting your tick off, but continual modifications, continual assessments, continual accreditation. That's what the noble goal looks like. We're a long way off that, but that's the trajectory we've got to go on to get there. And we can see August is approaching this year for SoCI entities to do their reporting. Started last year. This year you've got to do yearly reporting. We're definitely not doing it in hours or days. We're measured in years. That's got to change. Many entities also won't have one system that they're complying. It's quite common to have hundreds of systems, and at this kind of scale and complexity, an Excel spreadsheet's not going to cut it, and it just won't have the response times, the integrity of data to be able to do reporting in a continuous fashion. So where I'm going with this is I'm seeing to draw back to your question about rapidly evolving cyber threats and what proactive measures organisations could be doing to safeguard, it's to make the shift between retrospective compliance and to put systems in place that hold a live view of all the system's current compliance levels, not just one, but hundreds of different levels. Don't buy the robot, as Joe says, but we want to know where our systems are at from a risk and an assessment point of view in real time. So we need that live view. And we need that live view against different frameworks. So it might just not be one framework. It might be different frameworks for different systems, especially if we're regional and there's slightly different legislation. But we also want to be able to drill down to the granular controls and know where we're going for the next level of maturity. So we need that roadmap over time. And here's the other bit. When a threat emerges, bang, drops, another 0-day drops. We've already got all of our systems in there. We've got our compliance levels. We can rapidly assess, will this new thing that happened today affect any of my systems, and know in real time. So if I want to drill that back to what's one thing we can be doing now to really get ahead of that curve and be able to sleep at night, the number one key piece of advice is prioritise getting the continuous risk tools and people trained in them to give the organisational full visibility of the cyber terrain. This is to inform the business and inform business decisions backed by data on which move to make next. So that way, when you go to a trade show, Joe, you can load up this tool and say, we need a robot, or we don't need a robot, it's not going to do anything for us. And that way, you know whether you should buy the robot or not. And look, I want to draw back to something Dan said. Dan touched on this with return on investment on security controls. We need to know that if we're spending on a particular control, that it's going to have some sort of payback, long-term payback in the organisation. These type of tools will give that visibility backed by data to say this spend's going to return value, or this is one of Joe's robots. Don't buy it. So back to you, Joe. Sorry, back to you, Dave. I know that was a bit deep. Joe says don't buy the tool. I say you've got to have the right tool in the right place to enable the rest of business.
I just clear my name that I'm not a robot vendor. Sure.
And I think we've got a new concept here, Joe's robot, which we can definitely unpack at a later stage. Sean, that was great, thank you, and really so much more that I'd love to unpack. But unfortunately, in the blink of an eye, we've reached the end of our time. But I really want to go around the room and just ask our subject matter experts to just share 2 minutes each. That's 8 minutes. That's going to take us over time. Sorry, no. You're allowed 1 minute each, just on some pragmatic takeaways that we can share with our audience, that they can go back to their entities, just to start asking different questions, start challenging the thinking, start to challenge the way in which things are done. Maybe it's right, but challenge it. Joe, if I could start with you, a few key takeaways.
Sure thing, Dave. I'm going to stay in my swim lane and focus on the people side, but I would just say that my key takeaway for everything we're talking about here, everything in protective security in general, is think about what is the interface between what we're doing and the human beings that are going to have to do the thing, or the human beings we're trying to protect ourselves from in some cases. So it's got to be human-centric. It's not about your policies and procedures. It's not about the hardware, the gates, the access control, the cyber, the firewall. It's about what are the human beings going to do with that, either to work with it or to work against it. And if we're not considering that as the gateway to everything we spend on security, we're going to continually be mopping up our tears with $100 notes, because people will undermine any security spend, no matter how large, if we don't consider the human factors in how we design it. Both preventative, reactively, resilience, presilience, and compliance. The human factor is crucial, and it should be applied to every decision we make from a protective security point of view.
Mopping up tears with $100 notes. Joe, I think you're onto something there. I love that. Thank you. Doc, if I could throw it to you.
Thank you, Dave. I'll actually add to Joe's point without the $100 note component there. In terms, it has to be human-centric. As I mentioned earlier, we do need management systems, and I want to build on Joe's remark about the policies and procedures. If implemented correctly, with communication, consultation, and really understanding the dynamics of the organisation, that risk management tools of policy and procedures can actually be a culture development tool, but that has to be the mindset from the outset and not retrofitted. So if I can just add that bit to Joe's, I think he's spot on. And the last component here, again, is control what you can, manage and influence that which you can't. So what you're actually doing is be building up this sense of self and organisational self-efficacy, if you like, that we can actually achieve this in a sustainable way. That would be my key takeaways.
Fantastic. Thanks, Doc. Dan, if I could throw to you for some final comments.
Thanks, Dave. Dave, just to conclude in that, and we're going to hop onto some of the comments that that Joe made as well. For this whole scenario and the focus that we're looking at now, we need to focus on an integrated solution, and everything and all stands on one, and everything integrates on one, and each component relies on the other to work best. So definitely, if you want to make this whole system work, and integrated physical and protective security solutions, for that to work, we need to involve people, the teams. Even if you look at generic engagement in bringing on or advancing or upgrading systems, there needs to be constant awareness. There needs to be engagement with stakeholders, teams, the people that are involved, and the people that needs to manage it. And like I said, awareness, education is key in that.
Sean, final wrap up from you.
Final wrap up from me. People. Echoing the rest of the panel. Do our humans know what our cyber train looks like? Do we have systems owners for each part of it? And if someone's responsible and they know what they're responsible for, and they've got visibility on it, they know where they need to get to, and they know where they are. So visibility, ownership, all comes down to people. That's my key takeaways.
Thank you, Sean. And please join me in thanking our expert panel, Joe, Dr. Paul, Johnston, Dan, and Sean, for your valuable insights. I've got no doubt this webinar could have easily carried on for another 2 hours, but really wanted to thank them. I want to thank you for attending, for giving of your time today. I hope that you got pragmatic outcomes that you can take back to your entity. If any of our panelists have provoked any thoughts or would like to deep dive further into some of the concepts that we spoke about today, please reach out to me and I'll be glad to connect you with any one of them. Let me know. We've also got some resources for you to broaden your perspectives. We ran a series of webinars for the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Center just over a year ago. Those webinars are available on the CISC website, as well as our Securing Our Critical Infrastructure white paper, which was actually authored by Dr. Paul Johnston. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to say a big thank you to our production crew, Cherry and Janita, for putting all of this together, for putting the marketing together, and for, as usual, running an absolutely seamless production. So Without any further delay, I'd like to thank you for your time today. Business as usual. Carry on your day. I hope you valued the advice and the information that you got out of today's session, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Thank you and goodbye.